Well, hey, I'm Rick, and the senior pastor at the E-Free Church, and I'm joined here today with Omar Anaya and Billy Simmons. Omar is an associate pastor here at E-Free, and Billy is actually about to become an elder once we get rolling on that process and get things back to some new level of normalcy. And we're here today. We just want to have a discussion and really a dialogue about what's been transpiring out in, obviously, the culture. And our task today is we just want to share a little bit of our own stories and dialogue about this topic and kind of see if that can be helpful and encouraging to those of you who might be watching. So, Omar, maybe I'll start with you and maybe just introduce yourself. And the question I maybe start with you guys is a little bit about your background and your race and where you grew up.
Yeah, well, thanks, Rick. As Rick was saying, I'm Omar, and I am the associate pastor here at church. I was born in El Salvador, that's how you say El Salvador, in Central America. So I grew up there until I was 10 years old. And as a family, we moved to the States. And so my upbringing has been Latino, Kentucky. So it's like a mix of Kentuckian, Salvadorian, Latino culture. So when people ask me, where are you from? I said, you know, I was born in El Salvador, but I was raised in Kentucky. So I tell them I am kind of both. So that sort of was my upbringing in Kentucky with the Salvadorian background. My dad is a pastor of a Latin American church. So I grew up going to a 98% Latino congregation. It is also a Pentecostal congregation, Assembly of God. But that was my upbringing.
Yeah. Wow. Mm-hmm. Cool. Billy, how about you?
My name is Billy Simmons. I am from Gary, Indiana, which is just on the other side of Chicago. At the time I was growing up there, it was about 90% black according to the census. So I grew up in a place that's almost opposite of this. And so I grew up there. I went to college at the University of Northern Iowa to be an art teacher. And we know that Iowa is kind of, you know, the opposite of Gary in that sense, where I was probably the only black person at most of the events or places that I went to. And then after that, I met my wife there, we got married, and then we came straight here. So that's kind of my history with those things.
Yeah. And thanks for sharing. I grew up in Chicago and outside a northwest suburb called Des Plaines. And I would say that at that point in time, it was good 90% Caucasian and about 10% Hispanic, few African Americans, mainly actually growing Indian population from the country of India as well. So, and I think with a lot of it, I realized is however you grew up is your normal. So I thought that my normal was everybody else's normal. And so growing up in that culture, my dad, I will go ahead and share this too, because my next question for you guys is how has your race, you know, how growing up, the impact of race a little bit, you know, in your life. And for me, I never really thought much about being Caucasian, you know, being the majority, so to speak. But I look back and my dad, who passed away many years ago, was definitely, I would say, a low level from a standpoint of racist. Just not a high, you know, KKK by any means. But I think, as I've shared before with you guys in the discussion, is just some of the words he used, some of the terminology, speaking at the news or what was going on, the derogatory terminology that he would use. I knew something wasn't right, but I wasn't sure how to filter it. But that was also, looking back, probably pretty common. I grew up in the 70s, and that was pretty common because obviously segregation, you know, was coming off of that in the 50s and obviously 60s, especially the late 60s, the whole movement of segregation. So that's a little bit of my background. But let me ask you guys a little about just race and just impact on you guys growing up. What was it like? Yeah.
I can go. So, like I said, I grew up in a nearly all-black town, and we always, you know, there was always a handful of white students at the school that I would go to, or, you know, there might be a white family living down the street or something like that. And there wasn't a whole lot of conflict when it came to those things. However, when you're in a black community like that, even if your parents aren't telling you all the time, you're black, so you're different, and all of that kind of stuff. Even if you're not explicitly being taught that in your home and everything like that, watching TV, going to school, listening to music, all of those things, even leaving outside of town for different things, it makes it very clear that for us Black people that we're a culture within a culture, that we weren't necessarily the targeted audience for anything that we were watching in the media or anything that we were listening to or anything like that. And so we realized that we weren't a part of the majority, and that the things that were important to us aren't necessarily the same thing as mainstream American values, even though, we have good values and values that are important, and so do mainstream Americans, but they aren't necessarily the same, and there's differences there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes some sense. Yep.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, absolutely. For me, a little bit, it's different but same in some certain ways. Obviously, as coming to the States when I was 10, I first had to learn English. I didn't even speak the language. And I think from the beginning, there was always this realization for me that, okay, I'm in a completely different place than I'm normally. I grew up in El Salvador, and automatically, of course, race played an incredible part in my upbringing because I needed to learn the language. I needed to learn the culture, and at the same time retain my own culture, Latino culture and American culture. So it was a very interesting time for me, I would say, growing up, and race definitely played a part. I think the biggest thing from the get-go that even when I was 10, 11 years old, everyone in this country, when I came, assumed that I was from Mexico. And I was like, do you know that there are other countries that speak Spanish? It was, as a kid, I was like, no, it's called El Salvador, but it didn't matter where I went, whether it was Kentucky or whatever. As soon as they would see us and they see us speak Spanish, they would just think we're from Mexico. So that was very interesting as a child. For me, I was like, as I grew up, it made sense, okay, Mexico is the country that borders the States to the south, and that's maybe all they know. And so it was kind of offensive to me as a child, for sure, because we're like, no, that's not where I'm from. But it definitely played a big part in my upbringing and my development, being from a different race. So,
yeah. And we'll get more into that, too. I probably should share with folks, too, is that, I know when these things kind of hit, that, and we talked about this in our discussion a little bit ahead of time, is that things like racism and racial injustice, in reality, it can be something that actually people get on board with or feel in the moment, and then it can kind of slide away. I want to be upfront for those who are listening too, is that one of the things as a church that we decided these last couple of years is we want to be multi-generational and we want to be multi-ethnic. And because we've noticed in the Church of Jesus Christ that it seems like a lot of churches are just going to go younger, and it's important to reach those generations, and we do too, but not at the expense of those who have gone before us. And we want to respect that and bring together both old and the young together, because both can learn from each other. I think the other thing that we want to do as a church here at E-Free is we want to be multi-ethnic, that we want diversity. And that's only going to grow in this country, and that's only going to grow obviously in this community. Even Bloomington Normal, which you alluded to, is still primarily white, but we know that in less than 20 years that actually the majority will be people of different colors and nationalities, and actually the Caucasians, myself, will be in the minority. And so there's this globalization that's just happening right in front of us. All that to say is that we began to, did reading a book on the age issue and just making sure how we approach that. We've also been reading a book as a staff and elders called Bridging the Diversity Gap by an E-Free pastor named Alvin Sanders, who is an African-American pastor, and leading towards God's multi-ethnic kingdom. And so I also wanted to shoot out there that part of it, we realize we don't want this just to be a short-term thing. The three of us, we talked about, and the leadership and being on staff and others, we want this, we realize this is going to be moving forward. We want to engage in this dialogue and help us, as a church and as a movement, really, really become more multi-ethnic and diverse, because that's a picture that we see in the book of Revelation. And so I just want to make sure I clarify that part, as we continue down this path. Let me ask you guys, and I alluded to mine already, so I'm actually using some questions from this too. How has your race affected your worldview or your perception of life? Because I think it is a little different for depending upon our culture. And a lot of times, I think a lot of us as Caucasians, as white, as the majority, I never thought about this. Again, I've already alluded, I think most of us do this. We think that our normal is everybody else's normal. So of course you're going to see it through, you're going to see it through your own vantage point or your own filters. And so for me, I was just very ignorant until college of what even different cultures, like you just mentioned, Omar, about the whole thing about being El Salvadorian versus from Mexico, that's unintentional, but it's really ignorance, and a limited perception. But yeah, what for you guys? Yeah, how has your race maybe affected your worldview a little bit, your perception of life?
I think I would say real quick first before I get into that.
Sure.
I think also along with that, you kind of mentioned language.
Yes.
You mentioned how you don't really, you hadn't really had to think much about, your race or anything like that. Yeah. Being white in America and be a part of the majority. Another way to kind of think about that is language is a similar thing. Yep. If you're raised speaking English, a lot of times you have the option to go through your whole life without having to learn a different language.
That's right.
And culturally, being white in America can be like that. Yeah. So I think that's an important thing about stepping outside of your box. Mm-hmm. But anyway, as far as how race has affected my worldview, I think that just being a black person and being around black people a lot growing up has kind of shown me that even if something is good kind of happening in the mainstream, or even if I don't know, you might have certain heroes or certain standards that we don't necessarily fit as black people, but we still have our own heroes and our own standards and our own, values and things like that. Like I said a minute ago, that are kind of worth being interested in and are worth pursuing. But it kind of helped me, empathize with people who are not in power or who might be disadvantaged in any kind of way, because I, in some ways I have been disadvantaged because of race, or I have been excluded or just outside of cultural norms because of race. So that kind of gives me more of a connection with people who might be outside the mainstream or might feel disadvantaged in any kind of way.
That gives you some empathy.
Right.
To think of things from a different perspective and different vantage point. Because I hear you say is that you're saying, Billy, that's part of my perception, is realizing the perception is different because it's not main, it's not the majority, so to speak. Okay.
Right.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in a similar vein for me, how race has impacted my worldview is you come into a country and you're automatically the minority. You're not in the majority, and you're like, okay, I grew up differently. I have different music, different stories that we tell each other. Growing up to school, little kids were like, oh, you haven't heard this song or this lullaby? I was like, no, everything for me was in Spanish. And so it definitely does. I think for everyone, regardless of whether you grow up Latino, African American, Caucasian, anywhere you grow up, it's going to always play a part. It's always going to influence the way that you grow up and the way that you see the world. And so being from a different race and being a minority in this country definitely impacted, for me, the way that I saw the world. And as I developed and grew up, I was beginning to see, wow, we do things differently. This is how Latinos do it. This is how Caucasians do it. So I begin to see the differences between cultures, and I begin to move and feel comfortable with them. And I saw the good and the bad from both cultures. But it gave me a different perspective. And so I became a lot less dogmatic and less, this is how it should be, because I had two cultures within me that I was like, wait a minute. This culture does it this way. This culture does it that way, but it's okay. It's like I can see both good things, and I became less dogmatic about it should only be done this way. And so I think being from a different race really gave me that ability to see things from a multiple points of views and become less dogmatic about the right way to do everything. So
interesting. You both said that in different ways, though. So being a different race, ethnicity, actually created some flexibility. You had to be in some ways to be kind of that multicultural. Where I think, I think about that. I think about the people I know from different backgrounds. That is a big part, typically, of there's more flexibility versus sometimes the majority is this is the right way to do it. You alluded to a lullaby, or you let heroes. It wasn't until how long ago all the heroes were pretty much Caucasian, whether it was the comics, DC, Marvel, whatever it is. I mean, even the way they drew out biblical figures, all those different things. And so that's something that typically we have not thought about, I think from a majority perspective. Let me get to a tough question let me ask you guys, have you ever been discriminated against? That's the part that I think, let's talk, honestly about that.
Yeah. I think we both have.
Yeah.
We talked about this, and I'll share a few stories just to provide context, and just for people to know. Yeah, that question for me, when I'm asked that question, I'm like, absolutely. I think there's different levels. People have different experiences, but growing up in Kentucky, I experienced a lot of different discrimination. A lot of it was, I think I grew up, I played soccer in school, and in my school, there was a favorite couple of words that were told to me by people from the school, but also by people from other schools. When we went out and played soccer, there was always a lot of racial slurs that were directed at me. And that was sort of something that became very common. Like I was like, yeah, that's, they're calling me that, they're calling me this, they're calling me that. So definitely experienced that as a teenager, as a high school student, living where I was, and even from some of my classmates at some points. So yeah.
So let me ask you, how did that impact you?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I think your first reaction is anger. I think it's anger, it's frustration. Growing up in church and having a dad who's a pastor, those are things that we talked about. And so we sort of prep for those things, say, hey, we are the minority in this place, and some people are going to feel a certain way about that. So it kind of prepared me to deal and react in a way that was loving, but it was frustrating, it was angering, I think, many times for me, I think, initially. Yeah.
I think I appreciate you sharing that. When you shared that with me, it's interesting, Omar. It just really hurt me. I've known you now gotten to know you for the last couple of years, and I don't know, you just didn't even think about that. Again, I think because part of my answer is I've never been. We were laughing beforehand that I'm now bald, and so I've heard some bald jokes, but those are different. It's a lot different. I'd never even heard the term that you used was the term beaner.
Beaner, yeah.
And what does that mean again?
So beaner was probably the favorite thing for people to call me there. I don't know why. So in Latin America, you hear a lot of beans, and so I guess that's where it comes from. And so it's a racial slur to be like, oh, you beaner, and so that's something that was very prevalent. I heard that, it didn't matter. The other thing was Mexican, go back to Mexico or something like that. I've heard that a lot before as well. And that was something that growing up, I experienced that. But I think I want to share another story, Rick, that I think was, for me, we became even more powerful, more the reality of certain people's perceptions and stereotypes and racism. It was when I was a little bit older, as I was a senior in college, graduating college. And I was working with, I was going to work with Campus Crusade. Graduated college, I was going to spend a year in the Dominican Republic working with Campus Crusade with college ministry. And in order to do that, I needed to raise funds, raise support. And so I got an interview with the head pastor of a local church in Kentucky, in Bowling Green. This is a church of about 2,000 or 3,000 members, a pretty large church in the congregation. And I was able to get an interview with the head pastor. And I heard great things about him. I heard him before. I thought he was pretty cool. He was good. And so as we were interviewing, I'm talking to him about, hey, thanks for meeting me. I'm raising support to go to the Dominican Republic. I'm working with Campus Crusade. I know that church has supported other classmates of mine who work with Campus Crusade. And as he was getting to know my story and getting to know about me, one of the things that in the middle of our conversation, talking about me and what I was doing, he just asked me, did you come here legally? Did you guys come here legally? And I remember in that particular moment, I was just kind of like, it caught me off guard by surprise. I was 22 years old, and I was like, yes, but what? I was confused. I was like, what does that have to do with anything that we're going? And we kept going, the conversation. He quickly moved on. And it was right after the interview when I was sitting in my car, and I was like, that was messed up. I was like, what was that? It was in the moment when it happened, it was just caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say. I said, yeah, but I didn't know what else to say, I guess. But later, as I was in my car, I was reflecting, and I thought, wow, that was pretty racist. Yeah. I was like, why would he say that? And so that was, for me, I think, one of the biggest moments in my life where I realized this is a leader of this big evangelical church in my community. And he sees me a certain way. He assumes certain things about me by asking that question. And it hit me. I was like, okay, this is very pervasive, even in the places where it shouldn't be.
Yeah, in the church,
That's where it hurt me the most. Like, this is the places where it shouldn't be pervasive in the church. And so it was very that was one experience that I still hold to my heart. And like, man, that was really hurtful. It was pretty bad.
Yeah, when you were telling me that story for the first time last week, I mean, and I can still see it. It still does, as it should upset you, And I'm sorry about that. Yeah, that even happened. Billy, how about you? Yeah.
I just want to share a couple of things real quick. One of them is a story that we've talked about before in me doing children's ministry here. How and I want to say that I don't have any anger towards this or anything like that. But over my lifetime, I've always been aware of these things, kind of living under race instead of having it over there somewhere. I've just always been aware of these things happening, and it's not like necessarily a big emotional thing for me, but when it's going on, I can see it. And so working in the children's area, helping out with the kids, a lot of times, at this time, I was coming back there every Sunday. And so I would get stopped by the same person every Sunday and from a pretty good distance. Sir, can you stop? Sir, can you stop? Like that. And I question myself a lot. I'm really not a person who's quick to say whatever happens to me, that happened because I'm black. So what I did was, and I was telling you this, there was a couple of times where I kind of like stayed pretty far back and out of sight for a while and kind of watched everybody else who served in the children's area every week like me just kind of go right through and with no problems and everything like that. Of course, this person knew them and was familiar with them and all of those kinds of things. But it might have been a little harder to, recognize me for that person. So what I started doing, like I told you, is I started carrying my the badge that said I help out here, and I started carrying the snacks like this.
Because you were bringing snacks down there.
Right, from a distance, so she could see, look, I'm here to help the kids, everything like that. But that problem still went on for a while until I kind of like met that person like outside of here. And I think that kind of helped out a little bit. But another thing that I wanted to share was, and I forgot about this story until I was just thinking about the one I just told, was that I'm also a teacher in East Peoria. So I went to a school play on a Friday night at the school that I teach at. And everybody, it was kind of the same thing. Everybody was walking through. It's one of those things where, you buy a ticket to get in, but nobody really checks your ticket. So everybody's walking through. There's a huge crowd, everything like that. So I get through. I'm in the middle of the crowd. I hear, sir, sir, sir. And so one of the security people who's working the tickets comes like bolting after me. He's running at me. And this was like 2 years ago or something like that. He's running at me, and then he stops me and said, sir, can I see your ticket? And that's like one of the only times I was really like dumbfounded by it. Is I showed him my ticket, and I was just kind of confused, so I just kind of stood there. I mean, I knew what was going on, but I was still kind of shocked by a grown man running at me like that. And my wife was there next to me, my wife, who is white, she's white, and he stood there and just kind of looked at me for a while. And then after a second, after he realized that this might be kind of awkward, he turned to my wife and said, yeah, can I see your ticket too? But they didn't ask anybody else for the, Yeah. So those are just a couple of things. And the reason why I share those two stories is not because they're these big, like, earth-shattering things that I'm so upset about. You kind of, when you're Black and you have enough of these experiences, like being followed at stores or security being suspicious of you, you have enough of these experiences to where, neither one of them really made me mad. But the reason I share these stories is because each one of them gives me like a little more insight into how a lot of these things that are happening between authority figures and Black people has a lot to do with fear and distrust, and that it's not necessarily that these people hated me or they're coming to hunt me down or anything like that. They just, for whatever reason, because of my skin color, they were suspicious of me and acted on that. So when I think about that, I think about, man, what if they were armed? What if nobody else was around to see what was going on? What if it was just me and them in a dark alley? They felt like I was following them or something like that. And that kind of gives a little more insight into how these incidents keep occurring.
Well, for me, you guys, I've obviously never experienced any kind of racial discrimination. And I appreciate you guys sharing those stories. I know there's others too, but I think it's really helpful for everyone to hear. That's kind of what it's like. And I think that's important to recognize as someone who hasn't ever experienced that. I would share this, is for me, it was really that kind of ignorance. I used the word ignorance, and that's what it was. For me, I just was around mainly white people. I played basketball, so I got to know a couple of guys that were African-American, but not really. We just didn't hang out. They were actually from a different part of town. And at that point in high school, you already have your cliques, you already have your friend groups. But it wasn't until I actually got my master's degree from seminary in counseling psychology, I joined an organization as a family therapist right out of seminary, where I worked for, get a load of this, one of only 3 units that time, residential treatment facilities for adolescent and children sex offenders. These were 8-year-old to 16-year-olds who had already committed sexual assault crimes. And I came in to do the family therapy part of it. Now, the town where it was located was a small town south of Chicago, primarily Caucasian, just a little town. My wife grew up not too far from there. But when I had to go do the family therapy, that's where it was very eye-opening for me. Some of the listeners might remember a couple of places in Chicago, South Side, called Cabrini Green or the Robert Taylor homes. And that's where about 70% of the clientele that I had to work with were from. And I'll never forget, the very first time going, I could still picture it all in my mind. It was all fenced up, barbed wire. I was incredibly fearful, very much scared, for my life. Didn't know what to expect. I had heard from a mentor that in reality, once they know that you are there to help, they look out for you. But that's just it. It was a them and it was a me, because I didn't have the bridges. I didn't have any real relationship with anybody of different ethnicity. And it was the most eye-opening and yet I think the most important experience of my life on this whole topic, for lots of reasons that maybe I'll get into another time. But here's my point, is that's where I learned what I thought were all nothing but maybe gangbangers and this violent culture. And they had their stories. There's things why things happened the way they did. But what I found out, these were incredible human beings who loved their kids. Oftentimes it was a grandmother, it was an aunt. A lot of the men weren't in the picture. I think there's other systemic reasons for that. But my whole point is these were people that were just like you and me and my wife and my family, who cared about their kids, who cared about their lives. And I'm thankful for that. It went from being very, very scared in those first few trips to after the first 6 months, I really enjoyed going up there and spending time. And I learned a lot. My point in all that is I think part of it's ignorance. I think that's part of where the unintentionality of we really don't know, and I'll get to a section here maybe in our discussion about maybe what we hope or what we like to see from others, especially Christians, and that's one of them for me is to remain humble and being willing to learn from others. And really be careful that you don't make assumptions, based upon the news or obviously in this day and age we've talked about before too, the politicalization and weaponization of the far right and the far left that tries to use it for its advantage. And so how important is it for us to kind of bridge this diversity gap? And again, how important is it for us to move forward, in this. Yeah.
Well, I think it's extremely important because as kind of both me and Omar alluded to in our background stories, the more perspectives you have around you, the rounder your view is of life in general. So I think the more people of, any kind we have around us, older and younger, male and female, just people of different races, people from different, nations, whatever. All of those things help you have a better understanding of what the world is like and what the world can be like for different people. And, specifically for us, what kind of things God cares about. If you are in one culture and you kind of stay in one culture for most of your life, you might start to get confused. And if you're a believer in Christ, you might start to get confused about, not thinking there's much of a difference between your cultural values, the values of your people, and the things that God values. But there are things that I know that God cares about because of where I come from and who I've been around, that maybe not necessarily all the people that go to this church realize that God cares about those things. Yeah. So I think that it's important for, us to expand our, reach of like who's around us and to listen to people and to respect people and not to be overly dismissive of other people's personal stories, because that kind of blocks us from seeing a fuller view of who God is and what life means or what our worldview could be.
It really is a difference between being teachable and humble, versus being arrogant, ignorant. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, that was well said. I think I just want to echo that. Why is it important, right?
Yeah.
It's extremely important. I think as Christians, as believers, from Genesis to Revelation, everyone has what we call the imago Dei, the Greek, for the image of God. Everyone does. And I always tell people, don't you think it's interesting that God made us unique and differently? Mm-hmm. If God made so many different races, it's for a particular reason. And I think sometimes I hear the argument of people, oh no, we're not supposed to see any color or race. I'm like, then why did God made us so different? I think it plays an important part. And I think, why is it different? Because it's from Genesis to Revelation that you see that everyone that God created, everyone on earth is created by God. We have the imago Dei, and we have to pay attention to those things. And as Billy, you were alluding to, that is, man, when you grew up in a certain culture, a certain way, like we have to be humble enough to understand we're going to have blinders. Everyone does. You have blinders. I have blinders. Rick, you have blinders. We all do. And so this issue is it's so important because it's such a hard issue and an issue that you see from Genesis to Revelation. And it's something that we have to continually address and think through and talk about and realize this is what the heart of God is all about. It's not about whether you're left or right. I chuckle at that because I'm like, no, like filter everything through Scripture first before your political ideology. That's what we have to do as Christians. But unfortunately, we live in polarizing times where we have to remind people, you're citizens of the kingdom of God first, rather than citizens of the United States first. And that should be your false filter. And so I think that's why it's so important, because it's part of the heart of God. So.
And I think you just captured too what we're trying to communicate is that what you just said right there is this is kingdom value stuff. And I think what's so difficult for us as Christians and Christ followers is to filter because it's so strong politically. I think I've heard Tim Keller talk about this topic, and he's a very well-known pastor, actually ministered in urban New York City. And one of the things he said recently that really struck me, but he's right on, is that when it comes to these biblical social issues, that typically the right has taken on abortion, the right to life, and heterosexuality for marriage. Those are two, when it comes to social issues, and appropriately, those are biblical issues, that I think that evangelical Christians, that we would affirm that the right to life. But on the other side, the left, is the value of caring for the poor and poverty and injustice, which I think racism, falls under that social biblical value. And there you right and left, and yet all four of those are incredibly biblical issues. And that's what makes it so difficult, because how many times I've heard, well, you can't vote Democratic if you're a Christian because one of these two things. And I've also heard on the left a little bit, you can't be, how do you vote for, and the reality, it's not either or, it's both and. But I think obviously politics has hijacked that, and we're not going to fix the politics part. But what you said, I think, is so important, Omar, and that is, as a Christian, are we allowing that political perspective to overtake the biblical perspective? And that's why we're doing what we're doing today. Race is incredibly important, and I think there's a long way to go, and it has to be an important issue. I think that part of the teaching of the Bible is that the reality is Jesus came and he brought a little of heaven here on earth. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And the picture that we have of heaven is every single person from every different ethnos, race, nation, tribe, worshiping God the Father together, not separate, not in their own little corners, in their African-American sections, in their Chinese sections, in their American sections, all together worshiping together. And yet one of the most humbling, and I think, not only humbling, that's the word I want to use, I got to be careful, I'm on tape here. One of the most damning, I'll go ahead and use it, damning things for us as a witness in the church is it is still, Sunday morning is the most segregated hours in America. And something's wrong with that. And that's where I think that as Christ followers, we have to be better than that. And unity isn't in uniformity. Unity is the diversity. I agree with you, Omar, that God made the different tribes and nations. It's part of his plan. And sin, obviously, that plays havoc with us. Moving forward, let me ask you guys, and I want your perspective, moving forward, how do we do this? I mean, we know it's long-term, but how do we move forward this kingdom priority for pursuing multi-ethnicity in ministry? How does that, where do we start?
You want to take it first?
Sure, I'll do
some thoughts.
Thanks, Omar. I do think that even though it might seem like a small way to tackle such a huge issue, I do think that personal relationships, like in-person, in real life relationships, are probably the biggest game changer when it comes to changing our views about groups of people. So I think that starting personal relationships with people, like getting involved in their life and trying not to have like a shallow, sterilized relationship with them where neither one of you is comfortable enough to discuss the kind of topics we're talking about here. But if you kind of build up the relationship to the point where you can discuss those things, you might realize what is alike in your values and in your culture and in your background and what is different. And also along with that, you might realize that the differences don't necessarily mean that one of you is right or one of you is wrong, or, just diversifying in general. That idea is not an attack on the mainstream. It's just the idea that we are kind of used to thinking that there's a correct perspective in America in general. But I think the more that we listen and the more that we humble ourselves so that we can hear people, we're going to realize that there's a lot of different ways to look at something. And, perspective is something that everyone has. Nobody's perspective is the default, no matter how many people have it. and that we can all learn something from each other.
That's really good. That's really good. I think part of that is you'd say, too, I mean, obviously, you don't make the person a project either.
Right.
I mean, that should be a given, but I think it's important to reiterate that, too. You know, and I think that's so important, is realizing that no one culture has the corner on truth. I mean, I think about this from an Asian culture, from an American culture. We have this rugged individualism. And we're seeing it being played out, in my humble opinion, with the current situation with COVID-19, where in Asian cultures, it's much more community-oriented, much more respecting the community and others, sometimes to the overextent, where for our culture, it's all about the individual, my rights, my freedom, you know, what I deserve, what I think. And we're seeing that played out. And I think what I like what you said about that is learning from other cultures, you know, and neither one is fully right, and yet neither one is fully wrong. It's just a different perspective, and really we can learn from each other on that.
Yeah. I would say, you know, I think the first thing to say is this is such a big issue that it takes time to solve. But I think the first thing is we have to be aware of it, and we have to talk about it. We have to discuss it. I think when you see that this is an issue that it matters to God, as Christians and believers should be like, wait a minute, if this is so important to God, it should be important to us as well. And I think for me, the first thing is you have to look from the very beginning. There's so many stereotypes that we don't unconsciously don't even realize that we give into. And so you have to begin with being humble, looking inside of your heart and say, what are the stereotypes that I have towards certain cultures, towards certain people? Stereotypes usually are made from a small sample of a community, and then they just expand, and everyone assumes all these particular communities that way based on a small sample. That's how stereotypes begin. And unconsciously, we allow those to sort of distort our mindset about other cultures. And so we have to start analyzing and thinking, where are we getting our information from? I always encourage some of the students that I talk to as a young adult pastor, and I tell them, hey, make sure you get your theology, not just from your traditional Caucasian pastor, which is great, but also do Latin America, do African American. There's a lot of great evangelical theologians that are African American, that are Latino, that are white. I think get a deeper and bigger perspective, because we all do have blinders. And like you were saying, Billy, I think when you have a good perspective from different people, different ethnicities, you're going to get a better understanding on how do you actually begin to solve this issue. It is a humility thing. You have to be willing to be uncomfortable. And like we were talking about, starting those friendships with people from different cultures is difficult, and they can't be a project. It can't be like that. That's part of what the gospel does, is we have to see people with that love that God calls us to do, and it takes time, but it is, you know, stepping into that situation and be willing to be uncomfortable, and that's part of what we have to do cross-culturally, and we'll see how God will begin to move through that. Again, resources, different theologians, creating those friendships, our starting point to deal with the issue of injustice, of racism that we are seeing in our world today.
Yeah, wise words from both of you guys. So really enter into a relationship, you know, get to know somebody well from a different background. And then I think also go beyond I'm going to use the term echo chamber, go beyond your single source or sources and begin to read. And you talk about the theology part. By the way, the epicenter of evangelicalism is no longer North America. Now, to those who don't know that, or doesn't really care, it doesn't matter for them, that what that means is most of the writing that's coming out theologically is actually coming from South America and Africa right now. They are becoming the center of the evangelical movement worldwide. And I think that's really important. And to your point, Omar, is get beyond, you know, and we're gonna provide some resources. Not sure how we're gonna do that yet, but that might be linked here. Some different things for children, for youth, as well as some adults. And I think the same thing too is begin to read. I mean, that's why we're going through this book. I mean, as a leadership team, and we want this to be a lasting. We know it's not a, you know, once and for all, or get it done in 2 weeks or even a year. I mean, this is going to have to be, you know, a long-term thing. But I think, again, it's so well worth it. One of the things that really excites me personally is because in such a polarized world and culture, you know, that I think when you can show the unity, something that's almost supernatural, you know, where people are coming together and they're serving each other, they're loving each other, they're serving their community, young, old, black, white, Hispanic, you know, Asian, you know, in a way that still respects the differences, but yet goes beyond and is part of the kingdom work of the gospel, that's a beautiful picture. And we can't create that on our own. Only God can create that. But I think a lot of it starts just humility, recognizing I have a perspective, like we've all shared. We grew up, we had some perspectives. There's blinders. You use that term. I think humility is recognizing we all have blinders. And so that's the starting point for us, I think, is so important. In our last few moments here, just let me ask you guys, anything else that you'd want to share for anybody listening in on this, as we're just three guys just trying to talk about this and just trying to, do our part to say, okay, here's a little bit of a window maybe to what we're thinking. Maybe that might propel others to ask questions or talk to others. But yeah, anything else that you'd want to say to anybody listening?
All right. I feel like Omar's going to make me go first, so I will. One thing that I want to say is I think this was explained really well. I probably won't be able to replicate it quite as accurately, but I think this was explained really well in the book that we're going through, is that when you have, it's about, was it cultural DNA? Is that what? Yep. Yeah, when you have a group of people start an organization, they started, whether they know it or not, with their own values and their own priorities and the things that are important to the people who started. That could be the case for a church. It could be the case for a school, a government, even for a country. So when people come together and start something, they might not be thinking of how the certain rules or policies or just norms that they set in place or set in motion, they might not be thinking about how those things affect people who are different from them. They might not always be considering those things. So a lot of times a system can be biased against certain people. And, just to say it, we can have systems that are racist without even any type of nefarious, people plotting against someone and stuff like that, just because we all have biases and perspectives and things that we think are important about how things should be done. And again, that could happen at a church. It can happen in any type of organization. It happened in America as a whole. I think that along with that, racism can become worse over time, and things could become even more tangled and things like that when you start to deny or dismiss people's objections to things that are happening instead of listening and kind of being open to criticism or open to questioning about the way you do things. So I think that things can start to move in a more and more corrupt direction if you kind of put too much energy or put too much thought into protecting the people that organization or that country or that church or whatever was originally made for, or the mainstream, or whoever you're trying to protect. And so that way we can exclude people at best, and at worst we can even discriminate against people and hurt people. So I think that's a major thing, and I think because of that, just being nice and being cordial is not going to fight racism. I mean, it's good, but if your idea of being against racism is simply not using slurs, then racism is still going to develop around you and outside of you, and it's still, you might in some ways, inadvertently, you might some ways help it to move along and do what it's doing without even trying to be mean to anyone or discriminate against anyone and things like that. So I just want to say that there are racist systems, and I think our country as a whole is a racist system. And I think that this is not fighting against racism. It's not about politics. It's not about which side of things you're on. It's not for a certain side to fight against racism. I think it's in everybody's best interest. Yes, it does help some people more than others, but I think it's in everybody's best interest to go against racism itself and to go for, multi-ethnicity, increasing your perspective, increasing your community and your involvement with people who aren't like you.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. And I would just, to give a specific example, Billy, because sometimes people might hear in that you shared some things that are pretty strong, and that's good. I think, first off, I think silence is not the answer, but I think when we have to realize if we haven't entered into other people's perspectives, how they've grown up, that's what I think did it for me when I went into I call them the projects at Green and Robert Taylor homes. That's where I learned, and I coupled that with another seminary class called cultural exegesis. And that's where the importance where I learned it's not just exegeting the Bible and you give these, you talk about language. I think sometimes a lot of Christians get this, they don't realize the complexity and the importance of this is if it was just the Bible alone, then we would be using a Greek Bible and a Hebrew Bible. But you have to translate it into language. When you translate into language, we already know there's cultural issues there. So even if you look to the people who translate the scriptures, there's certain things that's subjective in the process. All that to say is you're trying to exegete the culture as well. And I think a big part of that, this class, got me into looking at the way school systems are the way that they're actually supported. And if you're curious, if you want to learn more about, is racism or some kind of systemic or at least the minimal residual effects of racism. I think one, giving a concrete example, would be the whole idea of taxation and how we fund our public schools. And I encourage you to listen to look at that deeper, and I'll just give you the quick overview, is that every state has a certain dollar amount that they will give to every student in the state. And then from there, the rest of it, the majority of it, is raised by how? Property taxes. You go back to the days of segregation, and you go back to the housing projects, which they were actually developed because back then, no people of color didn't have resources. They didn't have their grandparents and their parents' wealth from housing, and owning houses is the number one way to accrue wealth as well as education in this country, or has been. And none of that could happen. They couldn't go to college. They couldn't have a house. So that's the projects. There's no taxation. So the comparative of the suburban schools versus the urban schools is night and day when it comes even to this day to financing. So being in some of the richest schools in the state, Lincoln Way, New Trier, Winnetka, even where I grew up was a little bit upper middle class in Des Plaines, Illinois, we had resources, we had clubs, we had chess clubs, we had gymnastics, every sport possible, you name it, all of that. Then I go to Simeon, or I go to Whitney Young in Chicago, which I did have to go to at times. There's no computers. There's no extracurricular courses unless the teachers are willing to go beyond their pay, which some were, thank for that. But anyhow, I give it a specific example about that. And again, those are some of the issues that I think have to be addressed over time is how do we create a little bit more of an even playing field? So I appreciate you sharing that. I wanted to give a specific example of that. What about you, man? What do you think you wanted to share?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate all of that stuff, Billy, that you were sharing. I think the one thing that I want to leave behind to our congregation, just people listening, is we're at this very unique time where we have this polarization in our country. And I just want to say that the parties aren't going to solve this issue. And as Christians and as people, I just ask people and implore people to begin to filter things through what Scripture says and what the Bible says, what God says about cultures and races. And I think that the way for us to go forward is begin there. This is a big issue for God. This is a big issue all over Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation. And to begin to tackle that, we have to be united. I think the church has this unique ability in this polarization to create and to build bridges and to be such an impact in a way that will change lives. And for me, I just want to leave people with that, is that if we come together and unify, forget our political differences, but come together, be willing to be uncomfortable, be willing to be humble and to say, I don't know it all. And that's okay. And even if things are done differently than you've done it before, that's okay. That's part of being in the body of Christ. I just want to leave people with that, is filter things through what God says. Let's come together as a church, as a body, and begin to say, the heart of God, and let's begin to speak, to do, to act, to practically tell people that we are for all races, that we are for social justice. And I'm just passionate about that because I see it all over Scripture. It's there from Genesis to Revelations, and when you look at the Mosaic Law, what God gave to them, when you look at Isaiah, when you look at Jesus, you know, He came to set the captives free. It's there, and I just ask people to be mindful and remember that. And as a church, I'm excited that we're moving into that direction. It's going to take a long time. Change takes time, but I just encourage people to begin those conversations, to look things through that perspective, and to be humble and to learn from one another.
Yeah, that's been the theme, I think, of our discussion here. It's our little dialogue has been, I think, humility. And I agree. I mean, I think humility always creates the gap to learn. If you ever noticed that humble people are the ones that typically are leading and learning, if you're not humble, you have no gap there to learn. And God can't work. Humility is what creates the gap for God to work. And I think, you know, we don't have this all down. I think all three of us around this circle, we'd be the first ones to say, you know, we're just trying to take a step of saying, okay, here's what we're thinking, share with others. Maybe it might help others dialogue and have some discussions, not only in our own church, but maybe in the community and in who knows where else. Because I think it's important, and I totally agree with both of you, and I appreciate your courage in sharing some of these things. It is all the way through Scripture. You know, it's a beautiful thing. You know, God created this nation in the Old Testament to be a blessing to all nations, and the reason they were primarily judged was they got so into themselves. They got into protecting their own rights, or trying to capture their own thing, and they weren't sharing with the widows, the aliens, immigrants, and the foreigners. And I think, you know, with the poor, they were supposed to leave the olive fields, a certain percentage for those to come. I mean, all these beautiful things. And Jesus, again, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, again, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the mercy is given to those who are merciful. I mean, all these different teachings all the way through. And then that beautiful picture at the end of Revelation. And that's the one that gets me. You know, that's the one that I think drives me going, okay, we're supposed to be getting there, and yet we're not even doing it, you know. And that's where I think here we've begun that process. So I'm glad you guys are a part. You know, thanks for taking the time and the courage. And if anybody has any questions, if you want to jot those down, if this is on social media, or you can email the church at any time, and maybe we'll do this again. Maybe we'll do this again. But I think it starts. I think it starts with what we've talked about, and I hope this helps. So, Omar, I'm going to ask you with our time. Would you mind praying for us? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Dear Jesus, thank you, first of all, that you are God, that you are our Father, that you love us. Thank you for the diversity that you created from the very beginning of time. Thank you that despite of the craziness of the world, despite of how chaotic it may seem, we can come before you and trust that you're at work. We've discussed this afternoon or today, just a very difficult topic that is prevalent, not just in this country, but across the globe. I pray that you give us wisdom, that you give us humility as we go forward, and that you remind us that you put the Spirit of God in our lives to act, to be different, to be countercultural, and to present what the gospel says. And it is about people coming to know you from everywhere, from all different places, and bringing freedom to those who are oppressed. That's all over what you talked about. And so I just pray that you give us wisdom and humility as a church to humbly walk and to humbly be light in the midst of darkness, and to create and encourage unity, and encourage people to know and to get knowledge of what's going on in our world, in our country, and just to be faithful, Lord, to be witnesses in our community, and to just represent the kingdom of heaven here on earth. And I thank you for the time that you've given us today. I pray that you would continue to give us that wisdom and the direction as we go forward in the coming days. And I pray for our country that you give us direction, that you give us wisdom, and that we will hold on to you, Lord, as we move forward. And we trust that you are at work, and that gives us hope.
Yep, that's right.
That you are at work, and that the church will continue, Lord, just to be an impact in this world. So thank you so much for this time, Jesus. And it's in your name that I pray.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, guys.